Hello, I'm Salwa Kanana from the ILO communication team. I'm here at the 106th International Labour Conference. I'm joined here today by Mr. Elias Chuma, who is the ILO's Regional Director for Africa. And with me as well is Ms. Isabel Ortiz, who is the ILO's Director for Social Protection. Today we're going to be talking about social protection. These are two words that actually mean quite a lot to each and every one of us. You will also have the chance to send in your questions by writing in the comment box on the side of the page. So please do send in your questions. I'm going to start right now with Ms. Ortiz, because let's start with some basics. Tell me what social protection means in its broadest sense and who it's for.
Thank you very much, Salwa. Well, social protection refers to generally cash transfers for people. For example, a pension, an old age pension. So somebody gets old and then receives an stipend monthly or every number of months, just by the fact that the person has become old. So social protection is supposed to help to address vulnerabilities across the life cycle. So it's not only for poor people, as some people might think, because let's say the example of becoming old, all of us are going to become old at some point. So social protection will protect against a number of contingencies across the life cycle, and this will be in childhood, during maternity, in case of disability, in case of unemployment, a loss of job or lack of job simply. And of course, when you become older, pensions for those that become old. Now, many people actually tend to think that what is needed in societies is work. And it is true, we are much needed of work. But work is not the only solution, because not everybody can work in society. And if we look at global aggregate numbers, about 53% of the world population cannot work. About 35% are children, about 10% are persons with disabilities, about 8% are older persons. So therefore, altogether, they make about half of the world population that is not in a condition to work. So that's why you need social protection, which is a type of transfers that societies organize to protect these peoples in time of vulnerability. And it's part of the social contract of societies. So that's why it's important.
So give us an estimate about how many, what the levels of social protection are. I saw an estimate of 27% of people, that only 27% have adequate social protection. Is that indeed the case? I mean, that's quite a low percentage.
Correct. That will be the best. I mean, there are 9 contingencies in social protection, different types of schemes. So the number of people that actually have access to all the contingencies, all the different programs, that will be from child benefits, the option of maternity benefit if you were a woman, the option of disability benefits if you were a person with disabilities, an old age pension, etc. So you have the persons that have access to all of them. No matter, they might not need to enjoy them, but they are there. It will be only 28% of the world population, so it's low. However, the number of people that might access to only one is about 45%, so the number improves. There will be only one type. That means it will not be as comprehensive as the other one, but still better. But the important thing to notice, despite these numbers are low, is that there is a phenomenal progress in the way that social protection systems are being developed, and that is the positive news.
We will get back to that in a moment. I just want to turn to Mr. Chuma. As the ILO's regional director in Africa, how high up on the priority list would you say that social protection was for the world of work in Africa?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Social protection is a critical priority for the ILO in Africa. The ILO in Africa has identified 4 critical priorities. One is the employment question, and the second is, in fact, social protection, because it is related, as mentioned by Isabel. to work. Not everybody can work. But even in times when people have full employment, there are those that are always vulnerable, that need social protection. So it's a very important priority, and I think the coverage in Africa is quite low compared to other regions, but we've made tremendous progress in this respect, and we continue to work in this area, to work with governments at the national level, also at the sub-regional and at the regional level, to try and promote social protection as an integral part of really investing even in social capital, as it were, going forward.
But tell me as well, why is it such a priority in terms of, is it a case of increase in inequalities? What is the situation there?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. Part of it is because even in societies when things are working very well, there's always a portion of the population that is vulnerable and that needs to be provided for as part of the social compact, as mentioned by Isabel, through social protection. But what has happened in Africa more recently is that we've seen macroeconomic growth, which was quite impressive over 10, 15 years. But we've also seen two phenomena. One is an increase in inequality, and that's not just in Africa, but globally, but in particular in the African situation. And so it has raised the profile of the importance of social protection measures, not just to respond to the needs of those that have been bypassed by macroeconomic growth and development, but generally to respond to the widespread vulnerabilities that exist in African societies as in other societies as well.
Let us take a moment here because we have a first question from one of the viewers. This is a question from Lawrence. Lawrence is asking, how do we ensure social protection for those who do not have an employer and for those in vulnerable forms of employment? Would you like to take that, Isabel?
Sure. Generally, there are two ways to finance social protection. It may be financed by contributions, and that tends to be employer and employee contributions. And otherwise, it's social assistance, generally financed by through taxes, general taxation. Now, we do have a number of options there. People can self-contribute, be like independent workers and be contributing towards their own social security schemes, or be part of social assistance, and that's the way this is solved. It changes society to society.
Do you have, let's just take one more question that's come up here from Deepika. Social protection can help women make family planning decisions. Is that correct?
Not really. Not really. Maternity benefits tend to be not very high. They are just a small stipend that is given to mothers at the time of birth and during the first months of when the babies, when they have their newborns, to support them. And this generally is to support, basic consumption, meaning nutrition, basic goods needed at the time. And at a time that a woman will not be able to generate income because she actually is at the time of delivery, so she cannot work. And that's what it's meant for. These type of benefits do not tend to have any implication in the decisions about, natality or fertility.
I think it's a very important point, actually, that the intent of social protection in this situation is to really help the vulnerable, but it cannot be construed to influence decisions on number of children or size of family. As it were, I think that would be inappropriate, actually. But it's also not really possible. So,
There have been many studies. What Aeneas is saying is completely correct. There has been very many studies in many regions of the world, including Africa, that demonstrate that even child allowances do not have any meaningful weight at the time of parents to decide to have a child or not. Generally, to start with, because generally child allowances tend to be very low. They're just a small stipend to assist, again, in the nutrition of the child, and getting, basic clothing and things like that. So it's not sufficient to be a factor to consider.
To help them make a decision one way, or to
Correct.
influence them to make a decision one way or the other.
Correct.
I want to go back to the Africa region. I do want to talk to you about success stories, but before that, I do want to talk a bit more about perhaps some of the challenges. Social protection needs robust institutions. What is the situation in your region?
well, I think it varies between countries and in some cases between regions, as it were. I think some of the challenges relate to the capacity of the state to create and institute social protection flows. And then also the challenges around the institutional capacities to manage such systems, because they do require functioning systems, as it were. But there has been progress, and I think increasingly a lot of African countries now beginning to, create social protection structures and systems within their capabilities and within their means going forward.
I do want to discuss in a moment maybe some specific examples of successes, but I would like to get back to you, Ms. Ortiz. Can you, I think we skipped something at the beginning. I would like you to give me an overview, please, of very broadly how the ILO works on the issue of social protection. What are our main ways of working?
Thank you. Yeah, actually, ILO has been working in recent years in 136 countries, assisting them in the design or reform of social protection systems in all the continents. And there's a number of issues that ILO does. We always work under government request. Mm-hmm. So it means the government calls ILO and says we would like to have whatever. Mm-hmm. And this tends to be either to have a national dialogue, to agree which will be maybe a way to expand a social protection system, and this is a very common request that we get. And then in that you do an assessment of what is the situation, the current system, and try to see how it will be improved. And that decision is not only a technocratic decision, because decisions affecting social protection, the impact have a huge impact in the lives of people. So generally this is discussed in national social dialogue, tripartite, with employers, with unions, but with civil society, academics and many others that somehow shape a public debate, and then there's an agreement on which areas should be covered first. Mm-hmm. And then very often there is also a request about support with the minor reforms that might be needed to improve a scheme, to make it sustainable. And this could be any type of scheme. It could be a maternity scheme, it could be an old age pension, a disability pension. There are a number of a child benefit. So there are many different requests there. And then sometimes we also do get requests on implementation. So how to do it, so from, training of trainers, for civil servants that are going to be there, identification methods, so how are you going to identify all the beneficiaries of the programs, how are you going to register them, how are you going to have the computer system, to have them all enrolled, etc. So generally these are the areas that ILO works in 136 countries.
I have another question, and I'm actually going to tie it in with a question from Paula that we have just received. Mm-hmm. My question is, if you look around the globe, what are the trends in terms of what the countries are doing towards social protection? And Paula's question is, what are some examples of countries that have made giant steps in terms of social protection, where are we seeing the most progress?
It is a very, very relevant question. The thing is that there are two contradictory trends, two divergent trends, completely different. And a number of countries, very significant, the majority, are expanding social protection systems. A reason why is part of the Sustainable Development Goals and others. And let me give you an example there, is China. China is an impressive case. It has achieved universal old-age pensions in only 4 years. That is something unseen ever in the history of mankind before. Generally, administrations have taken longer, to do, the necessary steps to ensure that your population is covered. And you have to think the population of China is large. So it's a phenomenal effort. And it's very good. And they also have achieved nearly universal health coverage, same as pension, and they have a number of many other social protection programs that are also expanding. So very good example of expansion. And we can go in the reasons why, because they're very important too. There are social, political, and there are also economic reasons. Because China realized that in a way the export markets that it had, they are declining with the crisis. So actually you need to develop also your internal markets. And a way to do that is rising household income, and one of the ways is social protection. But anyway, but there are other reasons related to, the need to do it, modernization, it was the time was ripe. And then, on the other hand, you have a number of countries that are actually contracting expenditures in social protection. And this tends to be despite the government's will. However, it's in the context of fiscal consolidation that is occurring today, as we're talking, in 122 countries. Now, everybody talks about austerity in Europe, but it's not only happening in Europe. It's happening, unfortunately, in other regions as well. Very often because of the fall on the prices of primary commodities, the price of oil falling, and then fiscal deficits being there in the government. So therefore governments tend to cut public expenditures. Whether they cut social protection or not is different, because then that is the debate, internal debate. But a number of countries are having these temporary cuts on social protection, and it's something that we are watchful, because of course you don't want that the progress achieved now reverses. It will be very bad, no? So in principle what you want is to protect, precisely at a time of crisis, you want to protect vulnerable groups. It's not the time that you cut upon vulnerable groups, precisely the time that you protect them. So this is an expenditure that ILO advises not to touch, actually to protect. And there are other expenditures that can, if needed, may need to be cut, but not social protection. But generally, these are the two trends. So the expansion in a majority of all countries, and then some countries under this fiscal consolidation trend having to observe some cuts to social spending.
I want to take this moment to remind everybody that you're on a Facebook Live session with us at the International Labour Conference in Geneva, at the Palace of Nations in Geneva. I want to now address Mr. Chuma. Right. Now, you touched a little bit on what the ILO is doing to expand the reach and increase the levels of social protection in the Africa region. Could you give me some success stories?
Well, I think there's several. I would mention Mozambique as an interesting story, to the extent that they have been working on social protection more recently. And it's been built into the national budgetary process, which is quite important as well, because it depends on local resources rather than depend on aid, as it were. South Africa is quite good, particularly on the income grants, and you also have countries like Tunisia, but also countries like Algeria, which have got a long history of social protection measures at various levels, various types of services, as it were. And more recently, and Isabel, I think will remember, they even launched a postgraduate institution on social protection to train social protection practitioners in the Maghreb area, but also in Francophone and in the rest of the country, in the rest of the continent. So there are, several good examples. It's ongoing. I think the difference between countries probably is in degree of coverage, given the 9 strands that were mentioned by Isabel. Some are able, within their means, to cover or a lot more of the strands, others are not. So, but there's generally an attempt to build in social protection measures. There's a point that Isabel made, which is excellent, which is that by and large you see countries that are expanding, and that's a policy choice, in fact, when countries expand social protection. Those that seem to be fiscal consolidation, which is a polite way of saying cutting back expenditures on social protection, it's imposed, by the economic conditions that they face. And the debate is whether they should reduce expenditures on social protection, which is really an investment in social capital, as it were, or they should look at other areas where they can reduce expenditure, to respond to the temporary, decline in revenue to the national coffers, as it were. So it's an important debate. And as Isabel has mentioned, I think our role is to try and point to the value and the long-term importance of investments in social protection and investments in human capital.
Do you see that investment taking place in the Africa region?
I think it is, clearly. As I said, in the Africa region, the experience doesn't cover every dimension of social protection. So it's new in a lot of countries, it's growing, and I think by and large the intellectual debate around whether or not to have social protection is settled. By and large, most countries recognize the importance of social protection. It's a matter now of degree and capacity and expansion going forward.
I would like to remind the viewers that you can send in questions to us by writing in the comment box on the side of the page. Isabel, you did touch on this briefly, but could you also tell us a bit more about the difference between social protection and social protection floors, and where the floors are most needed and when they're most needed?
Well, it's a very good question. Traditionally, ILO has been working with the term social security, which is the traditional term that you have in the ministries of labor. Generally, you have then a section of the Department of Social Security. Okay, but in recent times, it became more fashionable to talk about social protection, to show also a diversity, to move away from only contributory schemes to go to other type of schemes that will be non-contributory and tax-based and simply paid to others. And this was the notion of social protection floor scheme, which reached an international agreement in 2012, where all countries of the world agreed to implement and roll out social protection floors in their own country to ensure that coverage will be universal. It will be not just for those that have a job and can be able to contribute, but actually for everybody in society as part of the social contract. So what it reflects really is an agreement of the world that we're going to look at universal systems that will be for all, for everybody, no matter they have a job or they don't have, no matter their status. And then the way you do that is changes place to place.
We have a question from Zahir. There are very ambitious targets to reach high levels of social protection coverage in the near future. Are we on track to meet those targets?
The targets were determined by the countries in the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm a positive person and I want to say that yes, we're going to achieve them. But of course, we start in a difficult situation. We were mentioning there is this austerity trend. It's a short-term trend. It's not expected to stay here for very long, but it still is a bad start for many countries. So now the key thing is to fight for the extension of social protection as is happening in many countries. And we need to thank the enormous effort that is being put by people in all countries, really, at many levels, from civil society organizations, trade unions, employers, and of course the civil servants in charge of that are working hard to make social protection a reality. So this is happening. And if this continues, it is very likely, with the same push of recent years, we will be able to achieve ambitious goals, that is to ensure that everybody is covered by 2030.
You mentioned the 2030 and the development goals. Could you tell me a bit about the new global partnership for universal social protection, which was an ILO and a World Bank initiative?
Correct. This is in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's when all institutions, yes, the World Bank and the ILO are the leaders of this initiative, but many other institutions are partners to it. They realize that the fundamental thing is the expansion of coverage and the universality of the systems, and they need to cover all. And the reality is that we have started this 21st century in very odd manners. This was the century that we were supposed to be reaching a new stage in development, and here we are, still with very basics in many things. So that's why the acknowledgement of universality has gone from education, that everybody accepts that universal education is a must, to universal health, that was agreed by all world countries before the Sustainable Development Goals, and now universal social protection. And that's the importance of this, the commitment towards working to ensure that nobody is being left behind.
Mr. Chuma,
yes.
in your region, of course, as in all region, the ILO works with its tripartite constituents, that's the government, the workers, and the employers. If you had a message to give to them, to our tripartite constituents on social protection, what would your main message be?
Well, I think the message would be, for me, quite simple, which is that social protection is should not be construed as charity. Mm-hmm. It has to be construed as investment in human capital. Because when you, for example, provide vulnerable children with proper meals, with proper education, it means that you are preparing the leadership as well as the workers of tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So it has to be, it's not an expenditure, in fact. I think it has to be looked at as an investment in human capital. That's really the message, and going forward, as far as I'm concerned. And so our constituency should support this from the perspective of an investment in strengthening the economy, strengthening the society, and creating the next generation of workers, of leaders who are healthy and properly educated. This is really the context of social protection.
Mm-hmm. May I support that? Because there are so many studies that have been done, and they have impressive results. Look, in South Africa, it was demonstrated that households that had a pension, actually the children grow up 5 centimeters taller. Imagine. And this is because of the improvements in household income and then better nutrition. Mm-hmm. So the impacts of these small stipends in the household is enormous in terms of, and there are studies demonstrating that worldwide. In terms of child dropouts, they actually fall because the family has more income, so children don't have to help at home with work, so they can actually devote more time to school. In terms of simply attendance to school, of going to the doctor, to be attended, in terms of nutrition levels, in terms of health outcomes. From many points of view that tend then to develop, as Mr. Chuma was saying, much higher levels of productivity in the people when they are adults in a later age. So there are lots of evidence on that point of view, and it should still really be seen as an investment from that point of view. But there are other reasons that also they were mentioned before. And if anything has realized our world nowadays, it is the degree of inequality that we have is unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And now, generally, you go to developing countries, the problem is not so much. I know a lot of attention has been put about the poor, but the problem, if any, is the wealthy. Because you see, you have these middle classes, but the middle classes are very, very low income in the majority of developing countries. So actually, by providing social protection, you actually can raise household income, at all levels, and not just for the poor, but also for these middle classes that are low income. And this is fundamental for all the reasons we state. Plus, for political stability, it's very clear that you're going to have more stable societies if households have more income, as well as issues of demand. Ultimately, you're going to need some, a society that consumes products that are produced, and for that, households need income again. So there is for many points of view, to provide social protection is a way, to sustain a number of developmental objectives.
We have, I think, time for just two more questions, and after that we're going to need to wrap up. But I'm going to address one to you and one to you. From Narkis, I work at a Ministry of Labor at the Employment Policy Department. What are the best practices for developing countries which face ongoing budget constraints in terms of social protection and employment?
Well, the best practice is not to cut, okay? And that is the very strong message that we give you from ILO.
Cut the army.
Yes. Now, the reality is actually there are fiscal space options even in the poorest countries, but they need to be explored. So what happens is that governments very often are pressure, and there's very short-term pressures, and we know that they're in the international financial institutions. They also come with their missions, and they often, press to do sudden and quick cuts here. Now, if you can have a bit space and come back and think of the areas that you could actually expand your fiscal space for social protection and for any necessary investment, because they are. And there are 8 options that any country can use at one point. And these are, other expenditures to start with. That is, Aeneas was saying. But you may have other types of options like, defense expenditures, who knows, that they don't have such important social impacts. So this is the first way, the first time that you look around, the first way. Then you might want to explore other sources of tax revenues. And there are many types of tax in society, but they all should be explored to the maximum. Then you can try to expand social security coverage and that way you will get more revenues. So it means bringing people to the formal sector instead of keeping them in the informal sector. Try to bring in and they contribute for their own future pensions. You can lobby for more aids and transfers if you are a developing country and able to receive aid. You could actually fight and eliminate illicit financial flows, and these are illegal flows. That should really be avoided, from money laundering to trade mispricing and others. And the reality is that they can be fought, and there are good experiences from a number of countries. You can also better use your fiscal and foreign exchange reserves. You also can try to look at your debt situation and have a better debt management, either borrow, which tends not to be the case, or restructure or renegotiate your debts, though this is going to take more time. And then you can have a more accommodative macroeconomic framework, as we have seen in the US with the, more accommodative monetary policy. So these are 8 options that any country has, and they are in ILO. You may look for that, options for fiscal space. We work with that with other UN institutions, with UNICEF, with UN Women, and with others. And we work with governments to advise them simply to realize that there are other ways before doing the cuts. So think it twice. That will be my advice. Don't do them. And try to explore other options which will allow, will improve the fiscal position of the country, so these cuts have not to be done.
Very concrete steps that can be taken for very concrete results.
Can I just comment on this before we come to the... I think what is important is also to realize that this is not an issue for the Ministry of Labor alone. It has to be an integral part of the national development strategy. And if you're going to discuss fiscal space, then you have to involve the ministries of planning and the ministries of finance. I think one of the strengths of the Mozambique experience was that the issue of fiscal space was dealt with from the beginning. And there was involvement of the Ministry of Finance. There was also involvement of major international partners that support the financing of development in Mozambique, such as IMF. The IMF, in fact, was part of the committee of partners, that supported the social protection strategy in Mozambique. So it has to be looked at, because I think the question came from somebody who works with the Ministry of Labor, per se. It's broader,
Sure.
All the other investment ministries have to be involved in this part of the national development strategy.
I think we have time for one more small question.
Small question,
and
that's the
I'm
key
going to
word.
direct it to you, Mr. Chuma.
Yes.
What can developing countries teach the West about social protection? We talk a lot about Western countries, but surely they still have a lot to learn.
Well, I think it's not. The experiences are varied, as it were. There are good lessons from developing countries, and there are also good lessons from developed countries. Not all developing countries has as robust social protection systems as, say, the Scandinavian experience, as it were. Probably for African countries which came into this late, they can avoid the mistakes that were made by other countries, as it were. I think probably the most important is the issue of making social protection an integral part of the national development strategy and broadening the fiscal space going forward. But there are lessons here and there. And one of the areas that we're discussing in Algeria, and I think Isabel was involved, is the experience among developing countries themselves. I think that's quite probably nearer, rather than a country like Mozambique emulating what has been done in Sweden over decades, is it true? But experience that you see in, say, in Tunisia would be much more relevant to, say, Mauritania or some other countries, as it were. So there must be experience sharing everywhere going forward.
Mr. Aeneas Chuma, ILO Regional Director for Africa, Ms. Isabel Ortiz, Director of Social Protection at the ILO, and from myself, Salwa Kanana, from the ILO Communication Team and from the International Labour Conference, thank you very much for joining us.